This is your tribe.
Today we have a wonderful guest, Becky Lewis, with us. Becky, I just got to know her through our. I think it was the very first time I have a chance to meet with her or in person. It was the 50-year anniversary of Perspectives in Chicago this year, and she shared a wonderful message at the plenary. And today we would love to hear more of what's going on in especially the current measuring the mobilizing efforts of today. But before that, how about saying hi to everybody? Becky, the floor is yours.
Yeah, hello. I'm glad to be here today and hope that I can bring my passion for the people groups that still have no indigenous churches of their own to the rest of you.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much, first of all, for you know coming to this interview. And I know mission mobilization is always a passion for you. I think it's not just because because of your previous experience. Probably not just because you love the Unreached People group so much, but I do believe there's a drive for the passion of the lost, but also um, your 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 desire to share that kind of passion with others. Um, so why don't you share with us a little bit about your background, but also what brought you to this point, especially in terms of mission mobilization and using numbers and stats, and also God's word for mission mobilization.
Yeah, sure. Well, I grew up in the highlands of Guatemala in a tribe where my parents, Ralph and Roberta Winter, were missionaries. Um, I, life is normal for a kid, so it was normal for me to have my friends with dirt floors and fires in the middle of the floor and things like that. When we moved to the United States and my father became a professor at Fuller Seminary, I was going through high school, and he was asked to give a presentation at Lausanne
Yeah.
1974 by Billy Graham, whom he knew, and on the remaining cross-cultural mission task. Um, it was a very interesting experience because he had been teaching missionaries all this time, and he knew an awful lot. He'd even written a book called 25 Unbelievable Years about the expansion of mission work during the era between 1945, the end of World War II, and 1969. But when he was trying to figure this stuff out for his Lausanne message, he realized that he was never going to hear about mission work in a place where there were no missionaries. No missionary was ever going to come back, tell him about it. And so there was so much he didn't know. In fact, the paper that he presented, you had to send in a paper earlier, for people to read so they could respond. The paper that he sent in earlier and the paper that he actually shared at the Lausanne meeting were not even the same paper, because he found out so much in between the time he wrote the first paper and the time he made his presentation. But what shocked him, and he tried to show graphs and stuff, was that he figured out that the reason why the whole world was saying we don't need missionaries anymore was because only 13% of the world's non-Christians were in the cultures where all the missionaries and all the Christians were. And so
Yeah.
the churches on the field were saying, hey, we can handle these non-believers. But 87% of the world's non-Christians were in cultures that had no churches and had virtually no missionaries at all. And they were invisible. He called them the hidden peoples after that.
Yes, I still remember. It's still called Hidden People, and there was no such a word as UPG at that time.
Right. There was no such concept. And he was trying, they coined this phrase, a church for every people group.
Mhm.
We were going to do it hopefully by the year 2000. Of course, we didn't make it, but um, the way this impacted my life is he came back from that, and he started what became the Perspectives course. I was
Mm,
going to Caltech at the time, and he had me and my sister, who was going to UCLA. We went to the very first Institute of International Studies,
mm.
and there is where we realized what was going on. And we also had grown up in a field. So in our tribe in Guatemala, the whole Bible was already in the mom language. The missionaries that were there before my parents had won a significant proportion of the tribe to Christ. And so my parents were involved in like pastoral training by extension and stuff. They didn't really have to win anybody to Christ because the national believers could do that by themselves. So they were just helping train the pastors and stuff. So I didn't realize that there were places that had no believers at all either, you know.
Even you, as a
Yeah,
missionary kid.
well, yeah, because you think the whole world is like where you are, you know. That's very common. And so even my parents, were shocked by what my father figured out. And so my husband and I met my husband when my father founded the U.S. Center for World Mission.
Mhm.
His parents joined my parents, and I met him there, and we decided to go well, when I went to the 1980 Edinburgh conference, student conference on world evangelism,
Oh,
I
mm,
uh, I wrote in my Bible that I was going to commit my whole life to making sure that every people group had a church of their own, an indigenous movement to Christ. And then
mm,
my husband and I went to Morocco for 8 years. During that time, my husband, Tim Lewis, and I
mm,
helped found Frontiers because we realized that there were a rising swell of interest in the Muslim world, which was one of the areas least reached areas um, on the planet. And yet there was no mechanism. There were very few agencies sending people into the Muslim world. So Frontiers was founded out of that. He eventually became the international director of Frontiers for 10 years. When he was the international director, we went around to all of our regions to
mm,
see how they were doing. And we got to the South Asia region, which had, you know, 300 million or more Muslims are in South Asia.
mm.
Um, a huge percentage of the Muslim world is in South Asia, Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh being the
Yeah.
main countries. And we were shocked to see that we only had like 13 people in that region. Other regions had 300, 400 workers, and those 13 people were actually working in the Maldive Islands, which is part of South Asia. So we thought, wow, this is really not great. And
Mm,
so we actually moved to India, and we lived in India for 5 years. Um, that's how I became aware of the fact that the statistics had gotten skewed, that there was somehow it was not being revealed that where the greatest task was left to be done. And so
mm.
that's how I ended up doing all the graphics that I'm doing now.
Yeah, okay. So there are so many layers. I just need to unpack over here because
Oh,
number
sure.
one, the family legacy, of course. But also it's really good. By the way, it's really good to hear that, especially uh, your father, Dr. Winter. It doesn't really just impact their the generations after the Lausanne meeting, but also his own family as well. Sometimes me as a mobilizer, I always think, what kind of impact I'm going to have, just even to my son, just
Yeah.
yeah. But I think that's really sweet. That's number one. Number two, I think you just brought up a very important uh, uh, piece of information, which is really regarding how can we even measure where the most need is,
Mm,
because for everyone, especially Christian workers, we always set our ministry as the most important thing, the priority. you
sure.
know Even you're a Sunday school teacher, and I shouldn't say that's wrong, but you know but how do you measure that? But when you see the greatest need is yet to be fulfilled. So is
Yeah.
that some of the reasons that would drive you?
Well, definitely my husband and I went to North Africa because when we looked at the pie chart that my father made, which maybe I can show in a minute, that was the area that had no progress at all. It was like solid blue, you know. There were so few Christians and so
Mm,
few even nominal Christians in North Africa that they didn't even show up on the graph. And,
mm,
and so few workers that you couldn't even put them in a graphic form. And so we definitely decided to do that. But from the very beginning, if you look at the very beginning, most of the apostles stayed in Jerusalem, you know, and they worked with, nurturing the church that was developing there. And some of them, like Thomas, went to India, but God specifically called Paul to go where Christ had not been named, to go to the Gentiles, which wasn't even on the radar, frankly, of the Jewish disciples initially.
no, it's not.
Peter actually says in Acts, he says, now the whole world is heard, because of Pentecost. So in his mind, the whole world was the whole world of Jewish people. It wasn't the whole world of every people group on earth, even though that's what God promised to Abraham. He wasn't thinking about that. And the same thing is true today, you know, eh, and throughout the century. So I'm not saying that it's not valid, because obviously God could have changed that if he wanted to. So
Mhm,
it seems like, in my experience, about 90 some percent of the church of believers are called to reach people in their own culture, to reach their own families, to reach out, to people who speak their same language, who live around them. And
mhm,
less than 10%, maybe even less than 5%, ever in history go where Christ is not being named, go cross-culturally, go where they have to learn a new language. And it's, to me, it's amazing that the that God builds his church even through such a small percentage of believers. He
mhm,
still has, in the period of time pretty much between 1930 and 1945 or 1970, virtually all the tribes in the world have been brought to Christ. All the tribes of Papua New Guinea, 1,500 tribes, each with their own language, each
mhm,
very, um, historically speaking, very violent. All these tribes had a lot of violence. That's why they were so isolated from each other, because they were afraid of each
mhm,
other and they would kill each other, And so it was an incredible work of God to send missionaries
mhm,
from, all over the world to these tiny little tribes, the Amazon tribes. People were killed, like Jim Elliot was killed, and the four people with him. Um, People were martyred all over the world to do this. One thing that really bothers me is people say, well, we have the hardest people groups left. Absolutely not. We do not have the hardest people groups left. Every single generation has had martyrs, has had people put in prison. Even the very first people group that was won as a whole to the Lord, the Armenians, they imprisoned the guy for 15 years that was
mhm,
sent to them. And eventually the king said, please pray for my family member, and the whole nation became Christians. So I think we need to
mhm,
realize that even though only a small percentage of the church ends up getting involved in this, that it's incredibly important and incredibly powerful.
mhm. Yeah, many of us have been involved with mission mobilization, probably for decades. That's your case, but for me, it's just for a number of years. But as technology has changed, so have our approach and tools and we use in mobilization also changed as well, right? So, but we hear stories and testimonies about events and taking place in the mission field, but in many cases, then we are not too sure about the numbers and the stats, whether it's accurate. Especially in places like China, in the Middle East, you can only hear about stories and some of the, great testimonies from people. But how can you measure that when you have very, very little information? I always admire like Dr. Johnson had tried to put his encyclopedia together, but every time people look into some of the stats and people would challenge that, they said, "Oh, that's not right." Like Operation World as well. I don't know how many times I challenged Jason Mendricks regarding the numbers in China, but so how do you respond to that kind of
Okay,
question or?
that's an excellent question. I think if we look historically, so of course, when William Carey did his evaluation in 1792, he used information that's significantly less accurate than what we have today, but he figured out that roughly in the Catholic, era of missions, the gospel had reached about 25% of the world, and that 75% was left. And so he challenged the Protestants. He said, "Look, we have to use means. We threw away the model of having orders, Catholic orders, which did most of the mission work, of course, for the Catholics.
Mhm.
And but we need to use means." So he proposed societies where one person would go and the other nine. So here's the 90% again. The other nine would support the one person who went. And
Mhm.
he created this explosion of missions, which by the time my father did his analysis and his data was way better than William Carey's, but still worse than it is today. So in 1974, when he did his calculation, now 40% of the world had, of the world's peoples had churches in them, and he was evaluating those that had Protestant churches even in them,
Mm.
not just Catholics. So this was a huge, huge
Mm.
improvement. Um, and then between then and now, between 1974 and now, we've reached the point where now 75% of the world's people groups have established churches within them. Now, I'm going to comment on the accuracy. The
Mm.
accuracy is not as important as the reality. In other words, if you can identify, oh, there is a strong and active church in this people group reaching out and growing, that's sufficient to say, hey, the gospel has penetrated this people group. The gospel is
Mm.
now there, particularly if it's indigenous, by which I mean that it's in the local language. It's not seen as something bizarre and strange. There was this incredible 4-hour video. I don't know if you've seen it, called "The Cross in China."
Oh yeah,
Um,
of course. Yeah.
yeah, and it shows in that video, it goes through the history and Christianity seen a foreign religion, foreign religion, foreign religion. And then at a certain point in time, particularly when that little peasant girl started writing hymns that expressed the thoughts and the hearts of the Chinese people, and it went wildfire, over 1,000 hymns she wrote. Then there came a point in time when the Han Chinese people said, "This is our God, and he's for us. And this is not a foreign God. This is our God. He
Mm.
loves us, he has a plan for us." And then the church, the Han Chinese church, started to explode in spite of tons of persecution. They were
Yeah.
a very persecuted situation. Um, and so we can say then, okay, yeah, maybe 95% of the Han Chinese are still not believers, or maybe it's some people say 10% of them are believers, so
Mhm.
maybe 90%. But the crucial thing is now it's seen as a indigenous Han Chinese, this is our God movement, and that's what we want to see in every people group, in all these little tribes, in the Pacific Islands. And, they had to come to a point where they was like, this is
Mm.
our God. He loves us. He's for us. Jesus died for us. And
Mm.
until that point is reached, as long as it's still seen as a foreign religion, then there is
Yeah.
no indigenous movement there. And
Yeah.
we don't have to be accurate down to the percentage, we just have to
Yeah.
know, is there a movement there that is
Yeah.
seen by the people as our movement to Christ?
Yeah.
If it's true, then, supporting those believers and helping them reach the rest of their people group is a wonderful and uh, amazing ministry to have, like my
Yeah.
parents were doing in Guatemala. But
Mm,
there's still people group where that has not happened yet. There's still people
mm,
groups that are threatened and feel afraid of the Christian God, and he's somebody else's God, not ours.
mm. So let me get back to one of the very important, uh, question regarding the surveys and the data. We are trying to accomplish that kind of, portray that kind of picture. What kind of indicators do you think is very important for a people group or a country or nation to be reached? So, for example, some people say there must be a Bible being translated into their heart language. That's one. Probably a Jesus film, and some people will say how many missionaries being sent to that very country or that very tribe. What are the indicators you would say is important and crucial in this kind of, survey?
So the things in my data that I am analyzing are if there is a growing movement of indigenous believers. So, for example, you can have a Bible in the language, like there's been a Bible in the Urdu language since the time of William Carey.
Mm,
Now they've had, it's very, very out of date. And there are some more modern Urdu translations, but that doesn't mean there's any self-sustaining, enthusiastic, growing church movement in the Urdu language,
mm,
So it doesn't matter if the Bible is there, if it's not being used, or if it's not being understood, or if it's not being appreciated. There are some
mm,
Bibles that use, sort of like Hindi and Urdu are very, very similar, that use, that you could say, well, the people who speak Urdu can understand this language. Well, that's true, but they use Hindu background terms for God, and things that are just like jarring to Muslims. So if a
mm,
Muslim reads it, he's like, this is like idolatry. Forget that. I'm not going to read that book. That's
mm,
not our God. So
mm,
so whether they have the Bible or not does not make clear whether they're a frontier people group or not. They can have the Bible for centuries and still be a frontier people group. The same thing is true with witnesses. You can have witnesses there. So it's different from unengaged, unreached people groups. An unengaged people group is one that has no witnesses. And a lot of times, if a group has not had any witnesses, and some witness goes, then they become believers. But a frontier people group is that with no progress of the gospel, no matter how many witnesses have been there, for example, I'll take Turkey. Turkey is an example that's had thousands of
yeah.
witnesses. There's probably 3,000 missionaries there today,
Yeah. Probably even more after
even
COVID.
more.
Probably more.
It's such a beautiful country, and it has a long history in the ancient past of having significant Christian population. But and there are many actually Turkish speaking churches, but as long as it's seen as a foreign thing, this is like, we've got to get rid of these Christian churches because they're foreign, they're not a part of our culture. To be a Turkish person, you can't be a believer in Jesus Christ. As long as that remains, then they are still considered a no progress frontier people group. So that's what I'm measuring. I'm measuring which people groups have made the transition that we see happened in the Han Chinese, where they're now like, this is our God. This is our faith. Jesus is for us. That transition has to take place before we take them off of the frontier people group list. So if there's no indigenous movement to Christ, they can still be considered a frontier people group, regardless of how many resources, Bibles, or missionaries are there.